So in this video, I've already created a series of artboards that I'm eventually going to connect together, but I just want to focus on how we actually make content and design content within XD for this video. So first, the important thing to notice is this right-hand toolbar acts as a sort of properties bar, just like in Illustrator. So whenever I select an element, it's context sensitive and it changes the content that I can modify over here. So whenever I have this artboard selected, which I'm just using my standard selection tool up here at the top, you can see that it gives me a few different options, such as the width and the height, responsive resize, which we'll get into at a later date, scrolling, the appearance, which essentially means the background color, and if I want to do a grid layout, which is pretty cool. If I turn this on, it'll default to some different options that I can play with, such as different number of columns, the gutters. I can switch it to being a square, grid, all sorts of different things I can play with here. And it's kind of your decision on how you want to work with this grid. If you want to use it or not, that's fine with me. I personally don't use it. I will sometimes adjust things at a later date. But for now, that's pretty much all the options that we have on the right-hand side. Up above, we have a few other options that'll come into play later. These are your alignment tools. You probably recognize those from Illustrator. These are your Pathfinder tools, which you should also remember from Illustrator. So this will, add or subtract or overlap different objects. And then the repeat grid, which is really interesting. It allows you to kind of repeat elements. So like, let's say you were making an Instagram clone, you could repeat an Instagram image over and over and over again, so that we have a kind of scrolling interface that we can work with. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to use some of these making tools. So this right here is the rectangle, the ellipse, and the line tool. Right? It seems pretty basic, and it is. XD is much more simple than Illustrator or Photoshop. So I can make a simple rectangle by dragging it out. As you notice, we have our Illustrator radius tools in the corner. I can transform by grabbing different corners, sizing it up and down. If I hold down Shift, it'll snap. But really, since this is web design, we're working a lot with numbers. So on the right-hand side, I can change these numbers to like 0, rotation. I can give it an exact placement on my screen. We have smart guides, by the way. As you see, it's snapping around. We can choose for it to have a fixed position when scrolling. So if this was like a menu item up here, I could select this, and now it'll always be on my screen there whenever I'm scrolling. So this is good for like, a navigation bar or some other type of fixed element, maybe like a subscribe or a cookies bar at the bottom. We have this responsive resize, which is turned on by default. You can turn that off if you like. Again, we can work with this a little bit later. Then we have some appearance settings. So this is the opacity. So if I turn this down, it's less opaque. Let's change the color, which is under fill, just so that that's a little bit more clear. So as I turn it down, it's less opaque. This button essentially lets me change the radius of the corners. So if I say 25, it'll be more rounded. You have to click off for it to be enabled. If I do like 50, right? And then this one switches it to individual modes. So I could do this one at 10, this one at 20, this one at 50, and this one at 100. I'll switch it back to all being 10. Below that, we have the fill. Whenever I click that, I can modify the fill. If I want to work with a solid color, or I can change it to a linear gradient, which works just like our gradient tool in all of our other pieces of software. I could do a radial gradient, which again works just like it does in Illustrator. This should all be very, very familiar to you. If I want to save a preset after I have it selected, I just simply hit this plus, and it'll add it to like a little swatch right here. And now I can apply that to other objects. So if I drag out another rectangle and click its fill, I can click that swatch and it will apply that color. Let's go ahead and delete this. Go back here. Then we have the border options. I'm just going to put the fill back on something a little more standard. The border is essentially the stroke. I can change the size right here. So I can say it's 5, make it dashed, tell it how large of a gap I want. So really, this is all just the stroke tools from Illustrator. Change how the corners work, if there's end caps, all that stuff. So again, just play with these things. You understand how these work because you've worked with Illustrator before, so not a big deal. It's just working with them in a more limited way in this software. We have the shadow button here, which turns on and off a shadow. These will change the position of that shadow. And if we click on the shadow, we can change the intensity of it and even the color of it. And then lastly, we have background blur and object blur. Background blur, which you're not going to see until we put an object behind this object. Whenever we turn that on, it'll essentially act as like a kind of a filter blurring what's behind it. Object blur blurs the object itself. So I can make the object less blurry or more blurry. So let's say this isn't too common in web design, but like a good example of it in app design it's everywhere, but in web design a good example would be we have like a pop-up in the center of the screen that's saying like, please click here to sign in, and we want all the rest of it to be blurry. I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm just going to make a bunch of rectangles. Let's pretend that these have content in them. And then I'm going to make one rectangle that covers all of it. Over here in my layers panel, I can move my first rectangle on top of that rectangle. And then with this rectangle, I'll just check that background blur. And essentially what it's doing, see, it's blurring the elements behind it. So anything below this layer is getting blurred by this object. So if I move this object, see, it's almost like a little filter pane or a window pane. Useful, but not super widely used in web development, more used in app development. Turn that off. And we have our typical alignment tools here. And like I said, you can combine objects together. So if I make another, I'll just duplicate this rectangle actually. Command D to duplicate. If I select both of them, then I can start doing these Pathfinder tools such as adding, subtracting, and so on. You can play with those and figure that out. Circles work almost exactly the same way. You can see how they have almost exactly the same settings. And then the line tools have the same settings, but they only have a border, right? They don't have a fill property. I want to talk really quickly about the pen tool. The pen tool essentially works like how it does in Illustrator, where I can pull out handles and change shapes, but I would really not recommend using the pen tool in XD. It's much easier later to make your graphics in Adobe Illustrator and then pull them into XD rather than trying to use this kind of limited pen tool in here. So really for XD, I would say stick to the rectangle, circle, and line tools. Don't mess with the pen tool. But as you can see, there's really not a whole lot to learn here. It works just like how it does in Illustrator.